Good afternoon once again, and welcome to this session. We'll be discussing nutrition in crisis and protracted humanitarian context. I'm Felix Piri, and I'm your chair this afternoon. So we'll be having 10 minutes presentation and then 5 to 7 minutes of questions. And I want to request that be straightforward to the questions. We don't have enough time, so we need to manage our time within 2 hours. So I have in front of me 6 speakers, 5 are here and 1 is online. So at this time, let me ask Anjali to present, and he will actually introduce herself in details. Anjali, over to you. You have 10 minutes.
Hello. Hi, everyone. My name is Anjali, and I'm from International Food Policy Research Institute. I'm very delighted to be here. It's my first time in Malawi. So I'm very excited to present the findings of the study that I've been working on with my team at IFPRI. And this is about examining the effect of COVID-19 on women and children diets in India. COVID-19 turned our world upside down, isn't it, right? So one of the key indirect impacts of COVID was that it compromised food security worldwide. Several countries following the pandemic went into a national lockdown, and that prevented food access through limited mobility, reduced income, and it also prevented food supply through disruption in the food supply chains and suspension in the government food programs. And all of this affected diets. And that is of great importance because poor diets may increase malnutrition, mortality, and may also increase inequality in the society. India was deeply affected by COVID-19. I would say deeply, deeply affected. If you look at this figure at the right, you can see that before COVID happened, of course, there were no cases, but then in April, May 2020, the number of cases increased. And then in 2021, there was another peak. So the number of cases were huge in the country, but then the country was also hit by multiple peaks of COVID. The country went into a national lockdown, and that badly affected the economy of the country, and the other sectors were also affected. So because of this peculiar situation of COVID in the country, in India, we were really curious to examine its effect on women and children diets. So in this study, we examined the effects of COVID on women and children diets in India, and we also examined the variability in the effect of COVID on diets across socioeconomic strata, such as residence, wealth, and education status of women. We used the National Family Health Survey data, years 2016 and 2021. Our study sample included women 15 to 49 years and children 0 to 23 months. We first picked the NFHS 2021 data. So this data was spanned across 2019 to 2021, but then in the middle, it was interrupted by COVID. So we used this information to categorize the districts into 3 groups. That is, districts surveyed before COVID, districts surveyed during COVID, and districts surveyed during both pre and during phases. We restricted our analysis to only those 11 states in which some districts were surveyed before and some were surveyed during, so that for each state we have a before and during groups. Then we mapped the NFHS 2021 with the NFHS 2016 districts. We combined the 2 data sets, and that gave us the analytical sample for our study. The primary predictor of in our study was COVID exposure dummy. It had 2 levels, no exposure and COVID exposure. No exposure referred to the districts surveyed before 24th March. That was when the national lockdown was announced in the country. And COVID exposure referred to the districts surveyed on or after 24th March 2020. The primary outcome for women was minimum dietary diversity, and the secondary outcome was the consumption of individual food groups such as dairy, fruits, and also some of the junk food items were there. For children, the primary outcome of interest were breastfeeding practices, minimum dietary diversity, and minimum meal frequency. The secondary outcomes of interest included consumption of individual food groups such as dairy, eggs, etc. We estimated the effect of COVID on women and children diets using the difference in difference model. So it was a quasi-experimental design. We assumed here that the COVID, it was an unprecedented external shock to the system. The NFHS survey was not designed in response to COVID. It just happened out of nowhere. So we treat it as a natural intervention in our study. Now, people in the room who do not like statistics at all, they can just ignore this equation on the screen, and I can tell you what the model does. So we had two groups, exposure and non-exposure, and we had the time component, that is 2016 and 2021. So in each of these two groups, we first computed the change in the outcome of interest, and then took a difference between these two groups, and that gave us the average treatment effect on the outcome of interest. Because we also wanted to examine variability in the effect, so we ran a double difference in difference model. It's similar to the previous model, but here, in addition to the interaction of year and exposure, we also looked at the interaction of year, exposure, and strata of interest. The baseline findings, that is the dietary intake in 2016 data, it suggests that the women dietary intake in 2016, that is prior to COVID, was not great. You can see in this figure that minimum dietary diversity consumption of several individual food groups was less than 50% across COVID and non-exposure groups. The findings were similar for children feeding practices as well. In fact, worse, like if you look at minimum dietary diversity, if you look at some of the individual food groups like legumes and flesh food, the consumption was less than 20%. Over time, the women dietary intake improved in the non-exposure group. It also improved in the exposure group. However, the amount by which it improved in the exposure was less than what it was in case of the non-exposure group. So we can say that on an average, the dietary intake among women was 5.6 percentage point lesser in the exposure group compared to the non-exposure. The consumption of individual food groups among women were also more affected in case of the exposure group, particularly fish and green vegetable consumption. Breastfeeding practices improved across exposure and the non-exposure group. However, in these two figures, you can clearly see that the improvement was more in case of the exposure group. Minimum dietary diversity, minimum meal frequency on an average in the exposure group was around 7 percentage point lesser compared to the non-exposure group. The individual food group consumption among children was also more affected in the exposure group, particularly dairy and fruits and vegetable consumption. We found that there was a variability in the effect of COVID on women dietary intake across socioeconomic strata. So you can see in this figure that the dietary intake the impact on the dietary intake was more pronounced in case of rural areas, in case of households with less assets, and with women among less than 10 years of education. These findings were significant, as you can see that the confidence interval do not overlap. The findings were quite opposite for children. However, they were not significant. You can see that there is a clear overlap in case of the confidence interval. So in a nutshell, we found that prior to COVID, women and children diets were already poor across exposure and non-exposure groups. However, diets worsened following the pandemic. The minimum dietary diversity, substantially it was affected among women and children. The worst affected food groups among women included green vegetables, and among children it was fruit and vegetable consumption. And there was a significant variability in women dietary diversity across the socioeconomic strata. The breastfeeding practices coverage was higher in the COVID exposure group compared to the non-exposure group. So, concluding my presentation, I would like to say that as now countries, they continue to, put their best effort to promote the well-being of their citizens during and after the pandemic, it's important to take a long-term and a sustainable approach to improve the institutional preparedness to any external shocks like COVID or climate change related shocks. So it's important to design robust food systems, ensuring that food access is provided, particularly to the marginalized section of the society. And it's important to design multi-sectoral strategies to improve diet. So we cannot work in isolation. So if there are no livelihoods, there are no job opportunities, we cannot expect people to, eat a very healthy diet. So we need to work together. So it's important to design those kind of strategies. And lastly, more research is needed on the measures that may help to mitigate the effect of COVID on food intake and dietary diversity. So basically, what were those relief measures that helped to mitigate the effect of COVID on diets, and what were the pathways that actually led to a more pronounced effect of COVID on dietary diversity? So I believe this kind of research would be very helpful to design program and policies to improve diets among women and children. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Thanks.
Okay, this time now we call Chris to present. So over to you, Chris.
Hi, everyone. I've been asked to speak slowly, which is going to be a challenge to try to squeeze in those 10 minutes what I want to talk about. So apology already to the translator. Let's dive directly to the background of this study. So this is an ongoing collaboration between the French Institute CIRAD, my own organization, CIAT, and the World Food Programme. The objective was to really try to better understand how the actors of the food system are affected by armed conflict, and if some kind of lessons or recommendation can be drawn in the way WFP can then plan and implement their own intervention. The geographic focus was the Yaga province, which is the northeast part of Burkina Faso. So I'm sure that most of you, if not all of you, know that over the last 5 years, Burkina has slipped into a high political instability, which you can see on the right-hand side by the number of violent events that took place over time, and that's translated into a high level of food and security for the same area or the same province in the country. In that blue little circle is the Yaga province where we worked. So the way we worked was to obviously not simply focus on the producers, because we wanted to really try to understand the dynamics of the food system. So we looked at the other key actors in the food system, including the processors, transporters, retailers, and vendors. We used 2 series of surveys organized in panel. The first of which was really to try to assess and quantify the level of exposure of those different actors to the armed conflict, and also trying to understand the impact that those has on their business activities. And then the second was a more deep dive into the type of actually disruption that the armed conflict has on the different groups of the actors. We also used the Solan attack, which was the deadliest attack so far in Burkina, where 160 civilians died, as a kind of time markers where we run some analysis of the before and after in terms of how that has affected the activities of different actors. We managed to survey 291 actors, which was actually close to the 300, which was our target, which frankly is not too bad given the difficulty that we had to work there. Yes. Okay, so rapidly, in terms of exposure, not how, but who are the most exposed to the food, to the conflict, what we saw is actually that the different group of actors were not affected the same way by the same shocks. In particular, if you use the information regarding the people that reported being directed victim of some armed conflict, you see that the transporters were the ones amongst the 133 that reported to be victim of direct attack. The transporters are the one with the highest proportion. So it means that the transporters were the most exposed to those attacks. Now, when we look at the way that has disrupted their different activities, I usually don't show table, but this one is not that difficult to understand. If you look at the very left on, you see the 4 groups of actors that we were interested in. The next column shows the different indicators that we use to assess the disruption and the nature of the disruption. For instance, for producers, you see that we looked at the change in the cultivated area the before and after the sudden attack. You see some indicators in color. Those are indicators that we were able to collect for the 4 different groups. That was important because it will allow us to do some additional comparative analysis. In particular, you see, that I should also say that the last column is actually the relative change in those different indicators, and you can see that the change varies from -29 to -38. So broadly speaking, the actors were contracting their activities by about half. And what was interesting is that the transporters are the groups that show so the highest contraction. So they were not simply exposed. They were not the group that were simply the most exposed, but they were also the one that were the most affected, which in itself is not necessarily surprising. Now, in terms of factors that could help those different actors to mitigate or buffer the disruption due to those attacks, we tested 2 hypotheses. First, that people that have more assets or are healthier can actually use those assets to buffer the impact of the armed attack, and that the groups or the people that have a larger social capital, in particular network, can also rely on that network to buffer the effect of the shock. For that, we use some econometric analysis. And again, sorry for showing some table, but they are pretty simple. At the very top, you have 5 of the indicators that we were measuring to assess the difference of the disruption using different type of indicators. And on the left-hand side, you have the other factors that we use to try to explain those disruption. What we see is actually that across the 5 models that we use, a pretty consistent result, which make us comfortable in terms of the robustness of the result. And what those shows in particular that the level of conflict systematically appear statistically significant, which in itself is again not necessarily surprising. It means that the actors have been the most exposed to the shock are also the one that show the most disruption in their activities. What was more surprising is the next, which is that the level of wealth does not appear significant. So it means that the wealthier actors were not necessarily the ones that were able to mitigate the effect on their business. And then the third was the fact that systematically social capital across all the different models is negatively and very strongly significant, meaning that people were able to use their social network, in particular, the larger the social network, the more they were able to mitigate the impact on their activities. So, in terms of conclusion, of course, our model was not designed to show a strict, rigorous causal model between the level of exposure or the armed conflict and the food insecurity. So, people who wanted to see that would be frustrated. However, in relation to the literature on resilience, what we did was we went beyond the usual suspect. Most of the people that worked on resilience focused on the producers. We were able to include in the analysis the 4 other groups that I mentioned, the producers, the transporters, the vendors, and the retailers. We were able to show the particular or specific effect, mitigating effect of the financial asset versus the social capital. What are the implications for NGOs and organizations that worked on humanitarian intervention? Well, it means that since social capital seems to be such an important factor, we need to go beyond the usual income-generating activities or the livelihood diversification that usually are included in those interventions and start considering intervention that boost the social capital of those different actors. Something maybe I would skip, but we claim that it could be very useful additional information to the IPC table that, as we discussed 2 days ago, focus essentially at the household level. We claim that food security has to go beyond the household dynamics and consider the food system. Follow-up, this is, as I said, the ongoing activities. We want to now consider the impact of the internal displaced population in putting more pressure on the local system. We want to better understand whether it's important to support the individual actors' resilience as opposed to the system itself resilience. And then finally, beyond the resilience, we recognize that at some stage, the food system itself collapsed, which had explained the high level of food insecurity we observed. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for the presentation. Merode, you have the floor.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Melody Dakash. I'm a researcher at ISCC, which stands for International Security and Development Center in Berlin, Germany. And I'm also a PhD candidate at Humboldt University, as well in Berlin. And today I'm going to be presenting you a project that we've been working on in collaboration with my previous institute, which was American University of Beirut in Lebanon, and which looks at the short and the medium-term impacts of vegetable support intervention on food security. And this is a project that has been implemented in Syria's protracted crisis. So the idea here is that the idea of the whole project is that we do have some evidence on the impacts of agricultural intervention on food security and nutrition, but this is mostly in more stable developing settings. But we do lack evidence on this impact most precisely in conflict settings, including Syria. And so this is where the idea of the whole Seeds for Recovery project comes into place, is to try and fill this gap by looking at the impacts, the long-term impacts of a complex agricultural intervention on welfare, behavior, and social stability in Syria. So the objective of this project is that we want to improve our understanding on the impacts, the short and the long-term impacts of complex agricultural intervention in protracted humanitarian crisis. And we also want to adapt some existing approaches, but not only that, use as well some novel methods. Like, for example, we have part of our team who are using remote sensing data, other part who are using machine learning techniques to try and to conduct this rigorous impact evaluation in these settings. So this project is really big project, and here I'm just going to focus on one of the papers that we've been working on that looks at the effect of agriculture intervention, and more specifically vegetable provision, the provision of vegetable inputs and tools in Syria. So that's our project. And here we're looking at the impact after 1 year, and we're also collecting another wave, which is 2 years. I'm going to explain it further later. So this is basically the project, this is the FAO's Emergency and Recovery Program in Syria, and this is something that has been implemented at the national level. So here, I'm going to tell you which ones we're going to be focusing on. As you can see, this is the map of Syria, and we could see that we're covering all the governorates across Syria. That's a huge project that has been implemented across like the 9 governorates in Syria, and aiming to target 130,000 households. And here we're also covering all these governorates because we're trying as much as we can to capture the different agroclimatic changes, because this is what we care about. We care about conflict. We care about who are the people who have been affected by conflict and how. And here we can see there are different interventions that has been implemented by FAO, including animal feed provision, animal vaccination, irrigation systems as well. But here we're going to focus on the provision of vegetable inputs. So this is kind of a complex project. We did a quasi-experimental research design where we collected data from we tried to collect data from the same individual at baseline, midline, and endline. And so at baseline, we can see that we have 2 groups. We have the beneficiary group, are the ones who actually received this intervention. And here we're just talking about vegetable intervention. And we have the control group that did not receive any intervention. And then we collected another wave, which is the midline, and then after 1 year, post-intervention, and then another one at end line. And we want to compare before intervention and after the intervention. And here we're going to focus on the panel data set. And here we can see some of the dropouts. Some of them are not really significant, but at the beginning, which is at baseline, we could see that a whole bunch or a whole governorate that was supposed to receive the intervention did not actually receive the intervention. And then instead of just throwing them, not being part of the study, we thought we can just move them to the control group, and then because that's also interesting. So this is our panel here. We focused on the ones who were surveyed at baseline, midline, and endline. So we have also, this is just briefly the baseline sampling strategy that we used. We identified the potential beneficiaries per sub-district, and then we drew these samples proportionate to the number of the identified beneficiaries, and then we randomly selected the villages within each of the targeted sub-districts, And then we selected the control that are as similar as possible in terms of their accessibility, in terms of their agroclimatic changes, that really resemble a lot to the treatment village. So here, jumping to the results, here I'm just going to show you the balance table that we had. Before we do any analysis, we just want to make sure that the two groups are actually similar to be able to compare them. And here we can see set of household characteristics, including household gender, age, family members, and so on. And we can see that we had some of the differences in household head gender. We had some differences in water constraint, for example, where the control, they had higher water constraint. They were also the male-headed households, they were more in the control group. And that was kind of expected because we were kind of targeting female-headed households at the beginning because we considered them in Syria that they were the most vulnerable. And then we had also insecurity and conflict. We have also the control group that had higher exposure to conflict. And so here the idea is that we cannot really analyze before we make sure that the two groups are somehow similar in their characteristics. And so to overcome these imbalances, what we did here is that we used propensity score matching to estimate the average treatment effect from non-experimental data. And here we used the one-to-one nearest neighborhood matching because we had a really large control group where we could somehow always find a control household that matches our beneficiary households. And we also used the panel data after matching. We did the analysis using difference in difference model, but we also have used the fixed effect model as well. And here we have done also some robustness checks in terms of, there's really important, this is all really good. And again, the context is really key here. I know that you heard this so many times during these 2 days, but here context is really key because you cannot just use these findings that you see in stable settings and just, you cannot take them for granted, or you cannot just use the theory of change in stable settings to apply them in conflict settings. And here we're highlighting on the context again. It's also very important to run some heterogeneity tests, which is part of our team is also doing, because here we want to know who are the people who are benefiting the most from this intervention. And because we know like there are differences between the countries, but also there are differences within the countries. And looking at the differences within the countries, we know that conflict does not affect all the country equally. And so this is why running some heterogeneity tests is really important. And we have some preliminary findings on that showing that female-headed households and women who are living in a medium intensity conflict area are the ones who benefited the most from this intervention. And this is another paper that we're working on. There's also, we saw that FCS has improved and different food groups has also improved, but we did not see an improvement in resilience, which somehow we could explain it in a way that we really need another intervention that complement the current agricultural input intervention to see an impact on household resilience, because this is more of a long-term thing that we really need to combine such intervention to see an improvement. And again, this is part of a larger study that also used remote sensing data as well. And we have also some preliminary findings showing that rehabilitation irrigation systems also significantly increase the use of water and crop productivity, and in some areas restore to pre-conflict levels. So I'm going to stop here, and thank you so much for your attention. Happy to collect any questions, feedback.
Thank you, Merode, for the presentation.
Good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Kimani Murage. I'm a senior research scientist at the African Population and Health Research Center, which is a regional research organization based in Kenya. And I'm also a human rights defender, and I work with grassroots organizations to support them to promote human rights, especially in urban poor settings. So my research is about the COVID-19 and human rights to food, lived experiences of the urban poor in Kenya with the impacts of the government response measures. So those are the partners that we worked with, and the donor at the bottom. So in terms of, so COVID-19 was everywhere, and in Kenya, we started experience. The first case was identified in March, and the government rapidly put in measures to address the address the pandemic. And those are common to what was experienced globally, the lockdown, the restriction of movement, and especially to and outside cities like Nairobi, and social distancing. So the objective was to document the experiences, perceptions, and attitudes of vulnerable citizens in the informal settlements of Nairobi towards government measures using human rights, the human right to food lens. So in terms of just briefly about this lens, what I'm talking about. So the right to food is constitutionalized in Kenya and also globally. It's often a human right. And the elements include availability, which is about possibility of production or purchase of food from the availability at the household level or at the local market, accessibility both economically and physically, and adequacy, including quantity and quality of food in terms of nutritional value, safety, and acceptability of that food. And the state obligations, so the government obligations include one, respect, refraining from taking any measure that may result in preventing or denying individuals or groups to provide food for themselves, protect, adopting specific legislative or other measures regulating third parties' activities so as to ensure that they do not negatively affect people's enjoyment of the right to food, and fulfill, which is taking positive measures to facilitate the provision of for individuals' enjoyment of the right to food. So that's just the context of the right to food from the lens that we are doing this. So in terms of the methods, we did this using qualitative methodologies, qualitative group discussions, like focus group discussions and key informant interviews, but also participatory methodologies, including photo voice and digital stories. Here I'll just present briefly, but we have publications based on this work, which people can look at. And we did this work in sorry, I forgot to say that. We did this in 2021. So we were looking back. 2020 was the main time when the pandemic really affected people. And this was in urban poor settings in Kenya. In terms of findings, so the socioeconomic impacts. So these communities, they work in urban areas, and this where they live and where they work mainly in industries, and they are employed within their context in industries, and they work on a daily basis. They are paid on a daily basis. And when this COVID-19 hit and the government put measures for lockdown, so industries had to reduce the number of people in the industries, and there was the curfew, so people could not work sometime late in the evening or early in the morning. So those were the issues. And so this really made many people lose their jobs. And because they work on a day-to-day, they get paid on a day-to-day, this really impacted on their livelihoods because they didn't have ways of raising money. And some people, and for women, often they work as domestic workers in the neighborhood, in the middle income areas, and they also said how it affected them. They were not, like, the people who give them jobs were telling them that they were putting them off because they thought they couldn't, they probably could have been exposed, and they didn't want to be exposed also. So that really impacted the urban poor. So in terms of the impact on the right to food, this what you see there is a picture that was it's a picture that was taken by BBC. It was on BBC News of a woman in Kenya from the urban poor settings who was reported to be feeding her children, cooking for her children stones because she had nothing else to cook. So she kept cooking stones for them So by the time they are sleep, they wait until they sleep, and it continues. So in terms of food availability, it affected, this COVID-19 affected in many ways. In terms of movement restrictions, the supply of food from rural areas to the urban areas, and many urban people really rely on rural areas. So that really cut the supply to the urban areas, and the most affected were those people in the urban poor settings. The disruption of livelihood, so people are not, they did not have the purchasing power to buy food, and the quality of the food and the diversity was also reduced because of those measures. In terms of food accessibility, again, it's about the economic accessibility and the physical. Because of the restrictions, the economic impact, and also the supply was reduced. In terms of food adequacy, they were saying that because of those restrictions, the food in the market was of poor quality. Sometimes it was degrading. Sometimes there were no varieties because of especially of vegetables moving from rural areas to urban areas when the restrictions were there. So all that affected the issues of food. So in terms of coping strategies, these are coping strategies that are often in those communities, meals and reducing food portions. Scavenging, you can see those children there in my pictures. Those children are scavenging from a dump site to get food. There was the issue of sex for food. It's often there during normal times, but it increased, and it also was happening amongst women and also girls, and children by then were not in school, so really it affected young girls. Some positive coping strategies like food sharing and urban farming. Urban farming quite started during that time amongst several of the families as a way of coping. So they were just planting so that they can have something to feed themselves on. In terms of safety nets, the government put in place, and also NGOs put in place measures to deal with this, like cash transfers and food distribution, but they were marred with the irregularities. The money was not enough, and it was for a very short time because the government did not think that this was going to go for long. So it really did not deal with the vulnerability. So in terms of the conclusions and the recommendations, the right to food was not fully protected, respected, and fulfilled during this pandemic. And this is a very vulnerable community. So the government put in restrictions, but did not put enough measures to fulfill the right. Response measures should be human-centered in consideration of human rights. So in this community, they felt that the government really did not think about their human rights. And there should be deliberate efforts to make urban food systems resilient in the face of future. So our intervention talked about urban farming as a way of creating resilience in this community. We started an initiative called Zero Hunger Initiative, and we are working with grassroots organizations in these communities to promote urban farming. These are women groups and youth groups, and they have been doing this, and they are stories. Thank you.
All right, I think we have run out of time. Let's just give a hand of applause. So now we have an online speaker, Julie. So
yeah, my name is Jule Beck. I'm a member of the Development Research Group at the University of Constance. Today I will present findings from the Life with Corona Africa survey, and I will specifically focus on the role of food insecurity for mental health during the COVID-19 pandemic in Africa. This is joint work with various colleagues with different backgrounds, and we are very grateful for funding from the Federal Ministry of Education and Research, and also by the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. So we probably all know that mental illness and particularly common mental disorders, such as generalized anxiety disorder, which is the focus of this study, are a burden to affected individuals, but also to their social environments, meaning their families, but also to society as a whole. The whole mental health crisis in sub-Saharan Africa, with its very large treatment gaps, have somehow coincided with increased levels of food insecurity and also the COVID-19 pandemic, which then, as we've already heard in the session, further increased food insecurity. So despite these problems, we still know very little about the prevalence of generalized anxiety disorder, shortly GAD, in the context of African countries. So related to that, also the evidence on the specific causes and risk factors are very limited. For the existing research, most studies have some either data or empirical problems, which also limit the ability to actually identify causal links. Therefore, the two objectives in this study are to come up with reliable estimates of GAD in the general population, so not only on specific subgroups, and also I want to explore the role of persistent threats to survival, exemplified by both food insecurity and exposure to COVID-19 for the risk of developing GAD. So just let me give you some context to better understand what I'm going to do here. So based on global research, the prevalence of GAD is estimated at about 0.1 to 3%, so rather low. However, we also conducted a very rapid systematic review of African countries, and we could only identify 9 studies on GAD prevalence, which revealed a very large variation. So we found a prevalence between 0 and up to almost 50%. Also, we know that in general, risk factors are genetics, female sex, intergender transmission, of course, adverse life events, and physical health problems. So for the specific pathways or mechanisms linking our main concerns, so food insecurity and GAD, there are different mechanisms that are suggested in the literature, also based on different disciplines. So, for example, nutritionists would be more interested in nutrient deficiencies, which would then in turn affect metabolic processes and are then assumed to negatively affect brain function. In contrast to that, anthropologists are more interested in the social value of food, and then related to that, shame and different problems in accessing food, or also in culturally accepted types of food, would be then related to negative outcomes in mental health. However, we are focusing on something which we call a direct link. So we assume that food insecurity directly deprives from one of the most basic needs, and thereby can be considered a persistent threat to survival. So we know that the impact of immediate threats to survival, so often classified as traumatic events, so there's a very close link with post-traumatic stress disorder. Following a very similar logic, we argue that persistent threats, so long-term threats to survival, such as food insecurity, but also in our case, exposure to COVID-19, may also accumulate and impact mood and cognition, and then later on impact anxiety levels. Let me now briefly speak about the design of our study. So as I said, the findings that I present today are part of a very large global project, the Life with Corona project, and we conducted a phone survey for the African part of the project in 4 countries, namely in Mozambique, Sierra Leone, Tanzania, and Uganda. We were supported by local partners, which had very large in-house databases of mobile phone contacts, and using a stratified random sampling, which also accounted for gender, age, and location, we could then collect a large number of observations, and we used a repeated cross-sectional approach to do that. So this meant that we collected 500 responses per survey round and per country over 12 months in 2021. We only included adult participants, so over the age of 17 years, and there are more or less the same number of observations in our countries. Our main outcome of interest, as I said, is generalized anxiety disorder, and here we rely on most of the widely used and also validated scales, namely the GAD-7 scale. We use a cutoff value of 8 to estimate a diagnosis, so we have a binary outcome, and we use a 14-day recall period. For food insecurity, we are mainly interested in the dimension of access to food, so this is why we use the also widely used and validated food insecurity experience scale with its 4-week recall period. In contrast to these very good and validated scales, for COVID-19, we had actually to rely on self-assessment just because there is no reliable data on testing. And we came up with 4 binary questions that are intended to measure different dimensions of exposure to the virus. And here, again, we use a 14-day recall period. In addition, we also, of course, control for different socio-demographic characteristics of our respondents and the household they live in. Let us now have a look at some results. So what we can see here in these Venn diagrams is that overall, so meaning across all countries, the prevalence of GAD is around 23%. So that's the gray circle on the left. And prevalence of GAD is largest in Mozambique with up to 40% and lowest in Sierra Leone with 17%. Now looking at the overlap, we can see that around 17% of our respondents across all countries are affected by both GAD and food insecurity. So that's the overlap between the gray and the red circle. On the other hand, we can see that the overlap between GAD and COVID is a bit smaller. So that's the overlap between the gray and the blue circle. So only around 5% of our respondents are affected by these 2 types. Now looking at the results of our logistic regression, we can clearly see that both food insecurity, or to be more precise, being affected by moderate or severe food insecurity, and also COVID-19 exposure is significantly related to generalized anxiety disorder, in that sense that being food insecure is associated with 3.1 higher odds of developing GAD versus COVID-19 with 1.4 higher odds. As there's also, as I mentioned, this problem of potential endogeneity, in that sense that being affected by mental health might also be related to lower levels of food insecurity. We also conducted a instrumental variable approach. And here we use different district means of food prices, vegetation health, crop land availability, and topography as instruments for food insecurity. And these models also confirm our assumed causal link between food insecurity and GAD during the pandemic. So in a nutshell, we find that prevalence of generalized anxiety disorder was in fact very substantial in the countries we surveyed, so in Mozambique, Sierra Leone, Tanzania, and Uganda. So this means that we found between 2 and 4 in 10 individuals that actually presented with very excessive and also uncontrollable worries. And also we found that what we call persistent stresses, so food insecurity in COVID-19, but particularly food insecurity, were really found to be significant risk factors. And importantly, we could also confirm that the link between food insecurity and GAD is actually causal. So what does this actually mean for development and also for policy making? So we know that anxiety contains the action disposition for avoidance and also for defense. This means these very high anxiety prevalences that we find really necessitate programs to address violence in communities. And we also need to think about increasing social support in order to address anxiety. But also, and probably most important, we really need to address food insecurity as one of the key drivers of GAD, even during a global pandemic. Thank you. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
So at this juncture, I think we've at least learned from the presenters, the speakers, in terms of nutrition in crisis. These are issues which will be with us for many years, especially with the climate change and other things. For Malawi, we had experienced COVID, cholera, the cyclone Fred, and this was supercharged by Ukraine war. So it means, I think there are multiple things also that we're experiencing. And from the presentations, we have also learned 2 or 3 things. The most amazing thing that I've learned here is the cooking of stone, which probably I need also to get more information around. Otherwise, colleagues, let's give the speakers a hand of applause.